Since the beginning of the empire in the 1st century AD, the look of a Roman legionary hadn't changed significantly for more than 200 years. But the 3rd century was a rough one for Rome that left few things unchanged, and by the time of the 4th century, the Roman legionary looked little like it used to. And since the end of the 4th century signifies the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, or at least the Western Roman Empire, many people therefore assume the legionaries of the 4th century were somehow lacking compared to their earlier counterparts. So, in this video, we'll be going over the equipment of a 4th century Roman legionary to see how it differed from earlier times and what reasoning was behind the changes. So, let's go have a look. So here we have an example of a legionary during the late antiquity period, around the year 350 AD. The most notable difference with the legionary of the early imperial times is probably his shield. The typical shield associated with the Roman legionary is the remarkable curved rectangular shield, but the 4th century legionary was equipped with either a round or an oval shield, and it seems oval was more common. 3 such shields have been found in a single location in modern-day Syria, dating to the mid-3rd century, when this shield came into use at the expense of the old rectangular shields. These are the only surviving shields of this type, if they are to begin with. One reason to assume these shields were not your regular infantryman's shields are the gorgeous paintings on them, which are painted directly on the wood, which is odd, as normally shields would be faced with a layer of textile and rawhide. Therefore, some say these 3 oval shields were for parades or just display examples for a shieldmaker's shop, or that they were cavalry shields, which according to one ancient source were both lighter and more decorated. A document from the end of the 4th century has a beautiful illustration showing the products of fabricae, meaning factories or workshops, and in it we see several shield designs. These designs are more symmetrical and have clear recognizable shapes from afar, whereas the shields found in Syria are more like actual artistic paintings. The more straightforward designs shown in the documents most likely give us a more realistic view on regular Roman shields. Despite their non-representative paintings, the overall construction of the 3 oval shields still tell us a lot about the techniques in use. For one, these shields were domed, so not flat. This was typical for the rectangular shields of the early and mid-empire as well, and being curved increases the overall strength of the construction greatly. Clearly, this technique was not lost, so it only makes sense to apply it to this oval shield as well. Being domed also has another benefit. As the shield wraps around the wearer, it offers protection against more incoming angles of attack. But make no mistake about it, these shields are still very heavy and cumbersome, and would stimulate a compact battle line over individual style fighting. Lastly, the rounded corners, they give the wearer more freedom of movement when swinging his sword. This allows for a more active and loose fighting style, which ties into the next item to discuss, the sword. This sword is referred to as a spada, to differentiate from the traditional shorter sword called the gladius, the gladius being the sword used in the early and mid-empire. The spada was quite a bit longer, between 70 and 100 centimeters long, which is a lot longer than the average size of the imperial gladius, which was between 50 and 70 centimeters. This is also translated to the way of fighting, as these long swords were heavier and clearly had more reach. Therefore, these swords were better suited for wide-arching slashing attacks, having a greater impact with higher speeds. The blade itself indicates this as well, as the tip of the blade is rather blunt. Clearly, the focus of this weapon was not to stab with it. The combination with oval shields therefore should not surprise us, as both stimulate the same sort of loose fighting style. In a sense, the Romans went back to their roots, as in the Republic the legionary fought with a similar combination of long sword and rounded shield. The reason for this transition back in late antiquity is not clear. Clearly, the older, more stabby short swords with rectangular shields worked fine for the Romans. The reason probably lies in a mix of changing and adapting enemies, and perhaps the influence of foreign cultures being incorporated more and more into the Roman army, as this longsword was clearly based on Germanic-style swords. A last thing to note about the late Roman sword is that both the sword itself as well as the scabbard are generally far less decorated compared to their earlier counterparts. On the opposite side of the sword, hung from the belt, usually used to be the pugio. But in the 4th century, there is no more archaeological evidence or artistic evidence for the pugio at all. It seems it simply fell out of the soldier's favor. There's not much else to discuss here, but still worth noting, as the pugio had been a part of the Roman soldier's outfit for ages. On to the belt then. From early on in the Roman army, a soldier's belt was very important to him, for only soldiers were allowed to wear the military belt. This meant that when the soldier was not wearing any arms and armor, he was still visibly recognizable as a military man. During the 1st century AD, the military belt was more than just a simple strap of leather around the waist. There were several straps hanging from the front of it, which, together with the belt around the waist, were all lavishly decorated with metal studs and plates. By the time of the 4th century, the belt had gotten significantly simpler in its design. The hanging straps from the front had disappeared for good, and the metal plates seemed to have decreased in size and prominence. The belt itself, on the other hand, was far broader, up to 10 centimeters. So broad actually, they required metal fittings spanning the entire width, to prevent the edges from folding and keeping it flat. The 4th century decorations are more sparsely distributed across the belt and have slimmer and more playful shapes. From many depictions of soldiers wearing their belts, we know that most commonly belts were either undyed natural brown or dyed red. Overall, perhaps the belt shows most clearly that the trend in military design was towards functionality and no longer decoration and status. Another item where this is clear is the helmet. First of all, the helmet is visibly simpler in its design. Perhaps this item most of all demonstrates it's purely about the essentials now in the 4th century. What we have instead is helmets made out of 2 pieces or even more, and joined together by a ridge in the middle. This process was a lot easier and thus cheaper to make than the helmets of old, which were made out of a single piece. The neck guard was a separate piece as well, allowing for even more of a conveyor belt type production process. The neck guard was connected to the helmet with hinges or even sewn on. Arguably, this was an improvement over the classical helmets, which had the neck guard welded on, because this loose neck guard was much less of an impediment to your movement, albeit at the cost of some protection. Decorations on 4th century helmets are way less represented than they were in the early imperial period. There are some major exceptions to these, since the most beautiful helmets stem from this era as well, but overall the average 4th century helmet was simpler in both design and decorations. Continuing on the defensive list, next up we have his armor, made of scale. Scale armor was particularly popular in the 4th century, just as popular as ringmail. Ringmail was different from the earlier periods. In the earlier period, the ringmail shirts were short-sleeved and about waist length. By the 4th century, the shirts often reached to the mid-thigh and down to the elbow, or even wrist. Clearly, this offered more protection, at the expense of comfort, since such a large ringmail shirt is considerably heavier than a shorter version. For a further discussion of these armors, do check out our other videos specifically on armors, where we also include the famous Roman plate armor, the lorica segmentata. Some say the lorica segmentata was still in limited use during the late 3rd and early 4th century. This is based on very few finds of parts of this type of armor. It seems to us that the overwhelming absence of these armors in all other clear military locations should override those few finds, which are clearly anomalies. There is also not a single depiction of such an armor in this era, which usually is a very strong indication. Underneath his armor, he is wearing a tunic, of course. But the tunic of the 4th century had changed considerably from the simple tunic worn in earlier periods. Instead of being a simple rectangle with holes for head and arms, the tunic had now evolved into a T-shaped garment, meaning it now had actual sleeves. Not just that, but the sleeves were actually quite tight-fitting, which is in direct contradiction with the fashion style of earlier ages, where baggy used to be all trendy. The clear downside of such tight-fitting long sleeves is that it gets hot in the summer, since these tunics were customarily made of wool. The simple but ingenious solution was to make slits beneath the armpits. So now, the wearer can either use the sleeves or put his arms through the slits. These sleeves, obviously, can be tied behind the neck. Especially for a soldier who doesn't have the largest of wardrobes, such an all-weather garb is super practical, of course. This tunic is a simple red, a color that was very popular with soldiers during all periods of the Roman Empire. Other than that, there's no real stylish details on this tunic. but many other 4th century tunics did. From the many surviving mosaics and wall paintings, we know that the tunics could be very elaborately decorated. As you can see, there's round depictions on the tunics. These were embroidery, of which a couple have survived. These lavish decorations were so precious that they were actually cut out from old tunics and then reused on new tunics. This tunic seems not to have been exclusively military either, which makes sense, since fashion often traveled freely throughout society. By the time of the 4th century, the whole notion of trousers being barbaric was long gone. By their common occurrence on depictions from the 4th century, we can tell that by then they even had become fashionable, blue ones in particular, it seems. By some miracle, one virtually intact pair of trousers has survived and was found near the Danish village of Torsberg. Moreover, that exact same model is shown on depictions, so that we now have the images giving us some context, proving it was used by the Romans for starters, and the actual real thing, so that we know exactly what it looked like and how it was made. There's a couple of things that stand out about it. The trousers' legs are not open at the end, but closed, so that they form socks. Also, just like the tunics of this period, they seem to have been quite tight-fitting, which must have been the reason for the slits in the back of the trousers' legs, which provides the necessary room to wiggle your feet through and into the socks. These slits were then closed with a little string, for the real Roman skinny jeans look. Lastly, the pattern in which the fabric is cut and stitched together is quite weird, and so different from how we make pants nowadays. All in all, it's a very interesting item that is very distinctive for the late antique period. Alright, to top it off, let's discuss the soldier's primary weapon, the spear. When we look at the iconography of the 4th century, the pilum seems to have all but disappeared. Instead, we see all manners of rough depictions of spears on tombstones, wall paintings, and mosaics. Unfortunately, there seems to be no consistency amongst them. The same can be said for the written sources, which use all manner of different words for spears. There's simply no right way to weigh all this evidence and pick a single truth. This is simply the reality when dealing with the things almost 2000 years ago. Nothing is straightforward and self-evident. Something that is all too often disregarded by fellow YouTubers, unfortunately. So, long story short then, why do we depict the soldier with such a long spear, and such a colorful one? The color comes from the 4th century document I mentioned earlier, the Notitia Dignitatum, where spears are being shown with such colorful bands around the shaft. Looking at all the available evidence, which is too diverse and ambiguous to really discuss here, we've made the conclusion for ourselves that it is fair to assume a spear that was longer than normal for the 4th century legionary. Similar uncertainty reigns over other throwing weapons of the time. From handheld darts to smaller throwing spears, we simply do not know how common they were and which units were equipped with them. Therefore, we chose to restrict this video to the things we do know were standard gear for Roman legionaries of the time. And with that, we come to the end of this video. To summarize this overview, we can say that the design of the armament of the 4th century legionary strongly shifted towards functionality at the expense of aesthetics. This surely was a result of the crises of the 3rd century, which necessitated cost efficiency and speed of production. But it would be a gross mistake to assume, therefore, that everything was worse in this period, and that these legionaries were less than their earlier cousins. Not at all. These were still incredibly well-armed soldiers, with a quality and diversity to their arms and armor that would impress any contemporary foe, and did in no way underperform compared to the heyday of the empire.